Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the last scholarly session of this very intense conference, and it's a round table, and the theme of the round table is Jews and Polish independence 100 years later. We've heard a lot of material on this, and I'm hoping that the panel will be able to sum up what we've heard. Already, I think Jochen Böhler has tried to sum up some of the impressions, but we'll be able to do this again. Before I open the floor to the panel, I'll just very briefly introduce the panelists, some of whom have been introduced already, but I think it's always useful to do it briefly again. David Engel on my right is the Morris Greenberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at NYU and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a joint chair. I also had such a chair before I retired. He's also a member of the Holocaust Memorial Council and of the Commission on Polish-Jewish Relations at the Carnegie Commission on Ethics and International Affairs. I'm sure everybody knows his many works. I just mention in particular In the Shadow of Auschwitz, the Polish government in exile and the Jews 1939 to 1942, Facing a Holocaust, the Polish government in exile and the Jews 1943 to 45, Between Leadership and Flight, Holocaust Survivors in Poland and the Struggle for Leadership 1944 to 1946, and finally a very valuable little book, Zionism, in the short series by Routledge called Short Histories of an Idea. I suppose above all it's the two volumes on the government in exile which still stand as the most important study of this very important and complicated subject with which David is most known. Jochen Böhler is the senior lecturer in the area of war, violence and repression at the Imre Kertész College at the University of Jena. Among his recent books are the edited volume The Waffen-SS, A European History, and Civil War in Central Europe 1918 to 21, The Reconstruction of Poland, which will be launched at the Przystanek Historii of the IPN, Marszałkowska 21 to 25. I mention this address because I think that everybody here should be there to support Jochen in this, let us say, not entirely friendly environment. And he's currently working together with Johann van Puttkamer and Włodzimierz Boradzaj in the volume on violence in the series, the four-volume series, The Routledge History Handbook of Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th Century. Piotr Wróbel, who's the third speaker, is the Konstanty Reinert Professor of Polish History at the University of Toronto. He's the editor of Listopadowe II, 1918-1918, zarys dziejów Żydów na ziemiach polskich w latach 1881 do 1918, The Jews of Galicia under Austrian-Polish rule, and Double Memory, Poles and Jews after the Holocaust. I particularly like the book that he edited, Nation and History, Polish Historians from the Enlightenment to the Second World War, which is, I suppose, the best introduction to Polish historiography and a book which still retains its enormous value. Jolanta Żyndul, the last speaker, works at the Instytut Historii of the University of Warsaw and at the Jewish Historical Institute. She's also written extensively. Zajście antyżydowskie w Polsce w latach 1935 do 7, Apollinarii Hartglas, Na pograniczu dwóch światów, Państwo w państwie, Autonomia narodowo-kulturalna w Europie Środkowo-Wschodniej w XX wieku, and Kłamstwo krwi, Legenda mordu rytualnego na ziemiach polskich w XIX i XX wieku. She's also a scholarly editor, and here I'd like to again thank her because she was the scholarly editor of the Polish edition of my Żydzina, Historia Żydów w Polsce w Rosji, and she found an enormous number of mistakes, including mistakes related to the census, which we were discussing today, which I was able to incorporate not only in the Polish edition but also in the second English edition, and I'm enormously grateful for her enormous scholarly expertise in this general field. So this is the panel. many of whom have already spoken. And the theme of this panel is Jews and Polish independence 100 years later. I'll ask David to go first. I think David already expressed very eloquently his views on the subject last night. I'm interested to see how he modifies what he had to say last night in the light of the various discussions which followed. David.
Okay. So, has anything changed as a result of a night's sleep? That is the question. No, I'll take the opportunity, I suppose, in the lack of any further direction, to develop an idea that will try to connect the events that we've been talking about with later developments and to think a little bit about their legacy moving forward, which is how I interpret the title of this session. It seems to me that the events surrounding Polish independence created a pattern or a matrix of attitudes within various parts of the Polish community concerning Jews and their potential influence for good or for ill upon the fate of that community. In 1918 and in 1919 and in 1920, the Polish state was as yet inchoate, had no borders that were internationally recognized. There were many contenders for power in the region. Poland was also contending for international legitimacy and recognition. In particular, the fate of the eastern border regions was in doubt. Poland faced a considerable body of opinion within the diplomatic establishments of the Western powers to limit its sovereignty to what was called at the time the Polish ethnographic frontier, running approximately along the same lines as the current eastern boundary of Poland. And one of the questions that the Western peacemakers tried to sort out was how the territory between Germany in the west and Russia in the east could serve as an effective buffer against the rising Bolshevik menace. Those territories required stability. They required a population that would not be looking for a political alternative such as the one that might be represented by the Bolsheviks. And therefore, one of the questions that was very much on the minds of the British and the American and the French delegations at the peace conference in Paris. By the way, the peace conference took place in Paris, not in Versailles. There was never a Versailles peace conference, only a treaty that was signed at Versailles with Germany. Was what sort of administration, what sort of political settlement was going to lead to the greatest degree of stability. Now, if the non-Polish minorities that inhabited those eastern territories were not happy with the prospect of Polish rule, this did not augur well for Polish efforts to assert their claim over those territories, their claim being otherwise entirely historic and not based upon the will of the inhabitants of those territories. In this regard, news about pogroms in Lwów in November 1918, in Vilna, in Lida, in Pinsk, in those border regions didn't do the Polish case any good. The British Foreign Ministry was advised by a number of people who did not think particularly highly of the Polish case. One of them most notably was a former Jew from Lwów named Ludwig Bernstein, who became known as Louis Namier, one of the great historians of the 20th century, but he was very much an advocate for Ukrainian claims in that area on the grounds that Poles were basically all a bunch of chauvinists and could not be trusted to rule over non-Polish populations.
They were also a minority.
As I said, the Polish claim was a historic one. In order to buttress that claim, they had to be able to convince powers in the West that they could do a better job of maintaining stability in those areas than could a Ukrainian administration or some sort of federation of nations or any of the other ideas that were put forth for governing that territory. So the notion that Jews, by publicizing news of violence perpetrated by Poles against them, was publicized in the West and did damage to the Polish case, led some to commit the finalist fallacy, of which not only Poles but everyone is very frequently guilty, and that is to assume that events that do you damage are caused by a desire to do you damage, and interpreted Jewish reports as an expression of a fundamentally anti-Polish attitude, hatred toward all things Polish, certainly a lack of loyalty, but even more a real desire to do Poland harm. Many Polish spokesmen attributed to Jews a great deal more influence than they actually had. To Jews was ascribed responsibility for the imposition of the minorities treaties, which was viewed in Poland as an egregious affront to the sovereignty of the country. In fact, I can say, having looked into this situation quite carefully, Jewish influence and lobbying in Paris had absolutely nothing to do with the adoption of the minorities treaties. The minorities treaties were adopted mainly in order to solve a problem relating to Germans and the German ethnic minority in the western parts of Poland, and to obviate a situation in which Germany might be prompted not to sign a peace treaty but to return to war. Jewish input into the treaty was minimal, but nonetheless, that is not how things played out in Poland. Jewish spokesmen indeed tried to convince others that they had had a major hand in formulating the minorities treaties on the assumption that if you have no power, at least other people should think you're powerful. And that can be a source of power in itself. It turned out really to be a boomerang that operated against Jews. But in any case, the point is that it was within this context, the notion that there is some fundamental Jewish animus toward Poland that can do Poland real damage in times when Poland needs the support of the Western world, first crystallized. And it has recurred at various times in history. We see it in the Second World War, when once again representatives of the Polish government came at various times to Jewish spokesmen, to whom again they attributed enormous influence over public opinion in the West, quite fantastically, but they believed it nonetheless, imploring Jewish spokesmen to declare publicly that Jews preferred that Lvov and Vilna be returned after the war to Polish sovereignty, and that the annexation of what had now come to be known as Western Belarus and Western Ukraine not be recognized in the final peace settlement. Jewish spokesmen, by and large, refused to make such a declaration, and in the conditions of the time, it made perfect sense for them to avoid sticking themselves into the middle of this controversy. And there is a fascinating exchange that took place between Poland's the exiled government's former Minister of the Interior and later ambassador to the Soviet Union, Stanisław Kot, known very much as a friend of Jews and sympathetic to Jewish interests, meeting in November 1942 with the Jewish leadership in Palestine and saying, look, if you do not make a public declaration of support for Polish claims for Lvov and Vilna, then you will be exposing yourself to the anger of the Polish nation. You must redeem yourselves in the eyes of the Polish nation for the sins you committed in 1918 in Lvov, right? And that you are repeating now. And once again, as I said last evening, this is something that one hears from the most pro-Jewish elements in the Polish body politic at the time. I think it's not too much of a stretch to see this syndrome reoccurring in 1968. Right? After Poland, because of its support for the losing side in the Six-Day War and its breaking off of diplomatic relations with Israel, came to be seen in Western eyes less as the overrun country suffering under the Soviet heel, which is how it had been perceived largely until that time, and more as an agent of the evil Soviet Empire. Poland was fighting for its image there and concerned that Jews had done its damage. Certainly this was the case when I first started studying these things 40 years ago, in the 1980s. Certainly, when Poland once again captured the imagination of the West because of the activities that resulted in the deposition of the Gericke government, the rise of Solidarność. And I'm sure many of us remember the storm that was created around Jan Błoński's article in 1987. The poor Poles look at the ghetto, when we heard calls in Poland to put him on trial for violating certain sections of the penal code proscribing anti-Polish activity. I wonder if we're not seeing some of that today as well. In 2004, Mr. Putin was re-elected in Russia with 70% of the vote. He proceeded to proclaim the demise of the Soviet Union as the greatest tragedy of modern history, and began making noise about undoing the effects, certainly prompting fears throughout those countries with borders, or sharing borders with the Soviet Union, and also those a bit farther removed, like Poland, who have memories of Soviet domination. Here, once again, the ability of the West to support Poland and Polish interests became very important, and phrases like Polish death camps didn't help to foster Polish needs in the West. So I wonder, and I throw this out as an idea concerning an ongoing legacy of the period that we're talking about, that we're still dealing with perhaps today.
Well, thank you very much. There's a lot one could say about this, and I'm sure people will do so in due course, but I'll ask Jochen Böhler, the second panelist, to make his observations.
This I will cut this short. I have said already a little bit in my comment just an hour ago, and I would not be able, as eloquent as Professor Engel did, to really link 1918 with 2018 in this fantastic way. I limit my role here for now on commenting on two things that came to my mind during this conference, questions that I would have today still on Polish Jewish relations, and how we deal with when we are addressing these topics as historians. And one point I want to make 2 points, and the one is that I was thinking about how to contextualize it. I know it's already a very complicated topic, and I wouldn't propose contextualization if I would not think that there is something to gain in it. Just to remind you what you all know, but still we have to see that in this perspective. I think we have to look at it also in this perspective, that when we are talking about the Polish-Jewish conflict during and in the wake of the Great War, this is only one of so many conflicts that the young Polish Second Republic is witnessing. As you know, so we have the pogrom in Lwów is happening after the Poles have thrown out the Ukrainian forces out of the city. So there is the ongoing Polish-Ukrainian conflict. We heard about it in TED Weeks and in other lectures, also the Polish-Lithuanian conflict. We haven't talked about because it's not the issue here, but we should still remind ourselves on the years of paramilitary struggle in Upper Silesia, and of also the short but also very violent fight in Greater Poland, in Poznan area. We have even the fights between Poles and Czechs, even we have, and this has been already mentioned, but we could also dig in it further, because it has also its implementations for the Polish-Jewish relation. We have inner Polish conflict. Yeah, we are talking here about the National Democrats. We have heard the name of Roman Dmowski. We have heard the name of Pilsudski, and we learned a little more about Pilsudski. At least I did yesterday when it was a lecture on Jablona. But what contextualization? Yeah, we have seen. I think, or I have seen in this conference in a microscope what great variety we are really talking about when we are talking about the Jews in Poland in 1918. How difficult it is, and even more, maybe even impossible. Is it possible to say how the Jews, what hopes the Jews had towards Polish independence? And on the other hand, I think we have to ask also a little more in this context, which, if we talk in these categories, which Polish actors are we talking about? When we're talking about the National Democrats, it's quite clear, but the Polish spectrum, Polish political spectrum was much broader than that, as you all know. But what implementations did this have for the constant negotiation, or rather struggle, between Poles and Jews about the common future within the borders of the Polish Second Republic? So I would just invite us to look at it from this rather also broader perspective, and to put the Polish Jewish, not to level it. It has its importance on its own as a topic, but to link it sometimes also to the other ongoing inner and outer conflicts that the Polish Second Republic is witnessing in the years from 1918 to 1921. And the other point, the second point that I want to make is and I already have hinted at it in my comment to the last session on realia. I thought reality is realia. It's a category of experience. I know experience is a kind of fluent or hard to define category, as is nationality, as we have seen. But still, I was asking myself also during the conference, how much can we integrate the experience of the people into our picture? And not only, I mean, it's very important, the discourse and the political negotiations, as we have seen, they happen, of course, on the level of the elites. Where should they happen? No? On the other hand, we have armies, yeah, and they also have a saying, and these are not only the elites in the ranks of the armies. But still, if it comes to the Polish-Jewish conflict and the negotiations on it, it's an elite discourse from both sides. And I have asked it the question already, and but I still want to make this point clear that I do not know how much do we find out about how the people felt in the streets of Warsaw, of Łódź, or of Lwów in 1919. How Poles and Jews felt in the everyday life situation, which was so much also implementing other things than the Polish-Jewish relations, but also survival. But of course, the role of Jews and their legal situation would have would play a defining role in how to cope with everyday life's problems and difficulties after a war that has been as devastating as no war had been before. So, and I think it also plays a role here in our discussion. Something like, what I came about when I wrote my book, which I don't want to promote here, but it's just my thoughts here in relation to this conference. We're talking about Polish independence. We are talking about it, and sometimes the image comes like it's when we have 100 years of independence, and we see all these festivities and ceremonies going on in the streets. It looks like all the Poles, whatever we define as a Poles, wanted to be independent in 1918. Yeah, which is definitely not the case. Yeah, if we define Poles as a Polish-speaking and Christian population of the lands between Germany and Russia, you have 80% peasants, and not many of them have an idea what nationality is in 1918. You see it also. You know this. I don't have to tell you. I just want to remind us on this that there is a large minority, large majority of the population which is immediately affected by independence, which has no real relation or does still have to struggle and to find its relation to that very independence. No? And this plays, of course, also a role, and it's complicated, and I have no answer to this. No? But if I look, for example, on diaries or on files where you don't find them, of course, as you know, historians have a problem with the history of peasants. If it comes to the documents in the archive that have been left over what they thought, but what you can find is that they are suspicious about independence. So there is a majority of the population that the Polish leadership, the military or the political leadership, wants to win over for a national project because they are going to build an ethno-nationalist Polish state. No? So they are struggling to get them in. And on the other hand, they struggle to keep the Jews out, who want to be definitely a part, at least, of the state. Yeah. Also, even if they are aware, and Polish activists are aware that there is a difference in the self-perception, but still they are eager to participate. Yeah. And on the one hand, you have the peasants who don't really want to, or have to be brought to the hunt, as we say in German. And then you have a really active community which wants to be at the table and is not just allowed to be there. And then on the other hand, you have what has been already mentioned in the conference, which is what I'm dealing with very much, but I'm happy that we didn't talk about it very much in this conference, because we know that there was anti-Jewish violence in early independence, but it has been very well researched so far, and I'm not so sure how much as horrible these events are when we think about the pogrom in Lviv and on all the other incidents that had been so densely described by William Hagen in his book that came out this year. How much this says about the Polish-Jewish relations, but still, it's important. It's even more important if you think that Polish peasants normally you wouldn't see them as Polish nationalists, but they participate in harassing, robbing, and sometimes also in killing Jews. It's not only Polish soldiers; it's also Polish peasants with a maybe still lack of national identity, whatever it is, but with a certain participation in these ethno-nationalist struggles with lethal consequences. So, yeah, I think I've made my point clear. Thank you very much.
Well, again, thank you very much, and we'll now move on to the third panelist, which is Piotr Wróbel.
Thank you very much. The title of our session is Jews and Polish Independence 100 Years Later. So I would like to concentrate on this 100 years later. And let me tell you this. The centennial of Polish independence triggered the publication of a huge series of books on 1918. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them are very similar to each other and do not contribute too much, as a matter of fact. But looking at them, we can see that Polish research on the Second Republic, on the interwar period, has been terribly neglected. We don't have anything new on the Second Polish Republic, and this is a serious problem also in the context of our conference, because since we don't have this broader historical context, it's also difficult to talk about the Jews of interwar Poland. And the same thing, the same neglect applies to a history of Jews during the interwar period. I don't recall a recent good monograph on the Jews of interwar Poland. I know that some scholars are working on this, are planning to publish something like this, but the books are not yet out, and this is a problem too, that the history of Polish interwar Jewry is neglected. Now, the next point, some people believe that the history of mankind is a history of migrations. Now we deal a lot with migrations, and this is an important topic, so maybe it's worth talking about the past. And I would gladly read more about the migrations of Jews within the Polish state during the interwar period, particularly at the beginning of the interwar period, when allegedly hundreds of thousands of the so-called Litvaks moved to the west, and then the Galicianers moved to the north, and then there were integration problems in many communities. There was a very interesting Jewish community in Bydgoszcz, where there was a conflict between Germans of the Mosaic faith and newcomers from Kongresówka, from Galicia, from Eastern borderlands. Practically there were two communities in Bydgoszcz for some time. Then very interesting things happened because the main Bydgoszcz community recorded its sessions in German until the late 20s, when they started using Polish in their official bureaucracy. And guess what? In the late 30s, they started writing in Yiddish. Very interesting in a former German community. So I would gladly read more about it. And this applies, of course, not only to Bydgoszcz, it applies to Poznań, it applies to the entire Pomeranian part of Poland. And this is about migrations, but this is also about integration. Some scholars believe that those societies which are able to integrate newcomers are successful. And those societies which are unable to integrate newcomers are doomed. What does it tell us about the interwar Polish society, about the interwar situation in Poland? I would read about this more as well. Then the next issue. I'm from here, I'm from Warsaw. I was raised on the western outskirts of Warsaw, and I thought that I knew the region very well. I spent my youth in Puszcza Kampinoska, the Campinos forest. This was my playground. So imagine my surprise when I realized that actually in this region there were relatively numerous Mennonite villages and Mennonite communities. And they survived there until 1945, when the Poles killed them or deported them to the west. What does it tell us about our knowledge of, or my knowledge actually, of this society? What do we know about, say, relationship between those Mennonites and the Jews living nearby in those small towns and villages? So this relationship between Jews and non-Poles in the Second Republic would be very interesting to me as well. Then the next issue, self-censorship, let's call it this way. Can we, or are we allowed, we historians, are we allowed to go full speed and write whatever we want? Or are we supposed to be a bit political about our work and think what are we writing about? I spent some time researching the Jewish community of Białystok. You mentioned Vilnius yesterday, even Grodno appeared, Białystok. In 1918, 1919, the Jews, most Jews of Białystok, definitely didn't want to belong to Poland. And they published articles in their newspapers, and there were quite numerous Jewish newspapers in Białystok, surprisingly, and these articles were brutally open. You arrogant Poles, wait, the Paris Peace Conference is not over yet. They would decide about the future of the Polish eastern border. Don't say that this belongs to you already. How to write about it, how to talk about it, how to teach these issues. I'm not quite certain about, well, self-censorship, self-control, especially that I teach at a huge Anglo-Saxon university, which is a bit paradoxical because now over 50% of my students, and again, this is a good university. We are, by international rankings, we are on the 22nd, 23rd position worldwide. So this is a very decent place. But, about 50% of my students are of non-European background. They are mostly Chinese, Southeastern Asia, India, and the Middle East. And try to talk to them about the Holocaust, about Polish-Jewish relations, about all those things. Sometimes conversations with the Chinese students are particularly difficult about the Holocaust because, well, to give you a kind of extreme version of this, a ridiculous version, some of them say, oh, come on, some white men killed some white men. Numbers are not that impressive. There is no comparison between you and us. 60 million Chinese died in the 20th century. So what's your problem? But anyway, this is my problem: how to talk to them, how to teach them. What can I give them? What can I tell them? And what should I keep for myself? So this is the next issue. And finally, a slightly different thing. I have to say, I am a bit disappointed because the title of the conference is about hopes. I haven't heard too much about hopes here during the last 2 days. And I guess there were some hopes, right? In the early 20s, there were Jews who believed, in Poland, who believed that the future of the world Jewry would be in Poland. And they published on this, and for instance, this is why Iwo landed in Poland and not in New York or some other place, because they believed that this would be the best place to develop Jewish culture. So maybe we should talk more about those hopes, and yeah, they failed, but it's an interesting topic anyway. Generally speaking, however, the entire subject we talk about is rather sad, and the older I am, the more clear it is to me that this is a very, very sad topic, and I'm more and more confused and perplexed. Thank you very much.
Well, I would remind you that Baron von Oxenstierna, Queen Christina's principal counselor, said that history is the story of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind, and probably mostly the first two. Well, on that happy note, I'll ask Jolanta Żyndul to make her contribution.
I would like, at the beginning, to the organizer of the conference that they invited me. And this was, for me, even more important that I am only one of the 3 women who were invited to the conference from all over the whole world. And I hope that the next time when there is the talk about serious stuff, and we yesterday heard that this the serious conference, so we are talking about politics, and this is serious stuff, so that women will be represented in another way.
We did have ethnic diversity, but not gender diversity.
Nobody is perfect.
Nobody is perfect, yeah. And I would like to say some things about the conference, about what I have heard here and what I didn't hear. I would like to start with the past, and then I will switch to the future and to the present. The main question here was how did the Polish relations come so badly during the first years of the Polish independence. We talk a lot of violence, about pogroms, and I think, and about disillusions. What Professor Wróbel said, there was no talk about hopes. And I, during last months, maybe 2 months, I attended a few conferences about this topic all over Poland, and the situation was always the same, like here. Nothing about hopes. And I started to think maybe we should ask another question, and we should turn the question around and ask why did Jews backed Polish cause? And because there was a lot of discussion about who backed, who not, and I would like to ask how it was that some Jews backed the Polish cause. Because if you look at the 19th century history, the development of Polish history and Jewish history, we see that Jews lived for hundreds of years in different state than Poland. Yeah, the Polish Jews, the inhabitants of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they lived in Austria, Prussia, and Russia. There was no this time of pressed assimilation, like it was in these countries, in France, in Prussia, Austria, and even in Russia. So they were only small milieux, small groups, which started to assimilate to the Polish culture, but it was quite late in the second part of the 19th century. So even if there were assimilated Jews, assimilated, acculturated, whatever, they were very often acculturated not to Polish culture, but to the German, to the Russian culture. Only in Galicia, with the change in the second part of the 19th century, with the autonomy, some Jews started. There was a Polish and Jewish intelligentsia. You know, in the end of the 19th century, maybe 10% of Jews in Congress of Poland, they were treated. They treated themselves as assimilated. Yeah. So there was a question: why the other, who were not assimilated to the Polish culture, why they should back the Polish independence? They treat themselves as the citizens or subjects to the Tsar, to the Habsburg Empire or Hohenzollern Empire. So there is, and I think when we start with this point, it would be easier maybe to see this this complicated issues. The second phenomenon, which I think was not here mentioned, is the problem of ethnopolitical order, which was established already long before this conflict started to develop. This Polish-Jewish conflict started to develop. Jewish parties were established before the pogroms in 1918, even before 1912, already in the 90s, with the development of the nationalism, not only Polish but also Jewish nationalism, some Jewish parties were established, and there was only one attempt to change this ethno-political division. Yeah, it was in the beginning of 90s when Józef Piłsudski started to organize PPS, and he really wanted. I don't know, and I would like not to judge if it was only political. His political aim, or there was something more in it, but he would like very much to cooperate with Jewish socialists. And they decided to go with Russian social democracy. And I think for Piłsudski, it was a kind of having in mind that after the First World War he became a leading figure in Poland. For him, it was a kind of experience that he later on he had some he was not so interested in Jewish cooperation. But when we go to what was after the Second World War and the politics towards Jews, we see that, and exactly yesterday was the 100th anniversary of this law, that he, from the very beginning, stressed that the Polish law that the Polish law introduced the equal rights, voting rights. It was exactly on 29th of November when the new law was introduced, and Jews and women received equal rights in elections. So I would like to go to this discussion which took place yesterday about the date of November 11th, if it was, real, the real beginning of the Polish independence or not. In this case, I would like to say that Poland is not a very big exception. 11th, on this very date, November 11th, nothing specially happens. Only the First World War ended. This was only one thing which is here, which was here important, and this is of course symbolic date. In the first anniversary of Polish independence, Poles celebrated 14th of November. So the day when Piłsudski received the political power. Then, because of and then this celebration was switched to 11th because the First World War ended, and that's why I think it was a kind of a sign that Poland is a part of the Europe, the the First World War was a decisive factor why Poland received its independence. But there were another concurring date. Also, the 6th of August were very much important in this first years of Polish independence. So it was a historical process. As far as we talk about Polish sovereignty and what does it mean sovereignty, I would like to say only that the symbolic dates are, you know, always symbolic. Yeah, they were always symbolic. Let me mention only two other countries which were mentioned here during the conference. American Independence Day is on July 4th, which, you know, at this moment America doesn't have a lot of factors which create sovereignty. The war lasted a couple of years, so the same in the case of Israel. So the Independence Day, and then they started to fight for their territory. So this is nothing, I would say, nothing special, at least for me. So on the, I don't know if I can say something more.
Yeah, please, just.
Yeah. The violence. The second issue is the violence, after-war violence, and I would like. There was already discussion about, and the comparison with Ukraine, and how the. I think in Polish case is a very important how the Polish society, maybe not only the fact that these events took place, but how the society remembered these events and what meaning the society. What is the meaning of these events for the society and how they are shown in the history? So, and in fact, I don't think that this violence was very much denied. It was explained only. I think it was explained, yeah, in a way which we can't accept. But the memory of these events, they were somehow in the Polish memory also. Piłsudski a lot of times commented these events, so they were somehow acknowledged, but they were explained in a way which I can't accept, and once again, some comparison. The after-war violence took place not only in Eastern country, but we can also talk about after-war, about the increase of the ethnical or even racial violence in other places, for example, America. And if we talk about 500 victims, which is a lot, I can only say that, and this is not my remark, this is the remark of the American ambassador in Poland during the time, that in the same time in America, in the lynching, were killed more Americans, Afro-Americans than Jews in Poland. And even and America started to somehow deal with this problem only in the last couple of years, when new commissions were established, and they somehow find out that not 25 people were killed in some events, but 250. So I would like to say that Poland is treated very often as an example of special treatment of others. And if we look at in a broader context, the picture is different. And my last remark is about the development of Polish-Jewish relations in the Second Polish Republic. So we have this very bad beginning and very bad ending. So the 30s, the second part of 30s. But between this time, these two periods, there was a, I would say, better period of the Piłsudski reign, when his regime started to cooperate with some part of the Jewish population, with Orthodox party, and the situation, at least for some years, was quite better. Then we have another factors which worsen the situation. I don't want to be very specific here, but we should look at Poland also. Yeah, we should look that there were different times, different periods of time. And from this point of view, I think that is somehow better, easier to understand. Also this badly times. Now, thank you, and I don't want to somehow, how to say, yeah, I know that there will be probably discussion about what I have said, but I would like to say this. Yeah, I wanted to say this.
Well, we've had 4 very interesting presentations, and now there's the opportunity for people from the floor to ask questions of the panel or to make observations. Please keep them relatively brief on the main topic. And the main topic is hopes of independence, but also fears aroused by independence. As several of the panelists pointed out, there was more on fears than on hopes. But I think we should try and talk about both and see this in the long perspective. It's 100 years since Poland became independent, and a lot has happened in those 100 years, as David pointed out, and the questions there are continuity and discontinuity. So I open this now to the floor, please. I should say also, and I really would welcome people speaking in Polish. There is simultaneous translation. It's much easier to express one's views on these complicated subjects in one's own language. Proszę.
Dzień dobry, przepraszam, że mówię po polsku, ale
to jest bardzo dobrze.
Moja angielszczyzna to jest mniej więcej na poziomie przewodniczącego Rady Europy, więc będę mówił po polsku. Mam jedną uwagę do pana profesora Engela. Dlaczego państwo, mówiąc o tych wielkich pogromach w 2018 roku, nie sięgają do dokumentów autentycznych? Na przykład do komisji senatora Morgenthała. Między innymi dlatego chyba nie można zarzucić, że komisja senatora Morgenthała, a później natychmiast po niej następna komisja, bo jej wnioski nie były być może zbyt przekonywujące, przyjechała następna komisja, już tym razem angielska, Spencera Samuela. I sytuacja jest następująca. Sytuacja jest następująca. Nie potrafimy znaleźć w polskiej dokumentacji w ogóle tych raportów, szczególnie raportów wojskowych, gdzie zresztą mamy na ten temat tylko jakieś opinie. Natomiast wracając do pani doktor Żyndul, wydaje mi się, że Polsce nie ofiarowano niepodległości. Polska tę niepodległość wywalczyła. I nie tylko na Kresach Wschodnich, ale i w Poznaniu, i na Śląsku Cieszyńskim, i również na Pomorzu. I sytuacja jest tego typu, że myśmy się jako Polacy modlili o wojnę narodów i efektem tej wojny było wykorzystanie rozpadu trzech mocarstw zaborczych. To jest wszystko, co chciałem powiedzieć, oprócz jednej rzeczy, że jestem zbudowany atmosferą tej konferencji, która nie przypomina pewnej atmosfery, która jest na przykład w pewnych dyskusjach naukowych w tej chwili w Polsce. I taka na koniec bardzo mała anegdota. Ja jestem, to pan doktor Wróbel będzie wiedział, ja jestem absolwentem bardzo znanego liceum imienia Rejtana. To liceum bardzo podupadło, ale w ostatnim miesiącu zrobiono z okazji stulecia niepodległości plebiscyt na najwybitniejszą Polkę stulecia. Nie wiem, czy państwo nie będą zaskoczeni. Najwybitniejszą Polką stulecia według dyrekcji, która tym trochę manipulowała i uczniów, jest Róża Luksemburg. Wybitna działaczka działająca w kierunku uzyskania niepodległości Polski. Dziękuję bardzo.
I think that we should take a few more contributions and then we'll get responses from the panel. Josh.
Thank you so much for the panel. I wanted to first say, Piotr mentioned that there wasn't that much on hopes. I thought maybe we could say that women got the right to vote in the independent Poland, and for Jewish women, that must have been an enormous sense of hope. And I'm assuming that there were many Jewish women in that movement for independence, for the right to vote. So that's something we could talk about as hope, plus the grant of citizenship. And I don't think the rights of women to vote was just granted. I think there was an effort and a movement. So that's one thing. The other thing I just wanted to ask. About if we could establish. Just want to ask about the anti-Jewish violence. So it's just about numbers. So the Morgenthau report in late 1919 gave the number of 280 as the estimate of Jews who were killed in the pogroms. And then William Hagen's book in 2018 says the lowest number is 400 and the highest number is 530. That's in his view. And the second part of that question is for, if I may ask Jolanta and Piotr, Jolanta's book, Zejście antyżydowskie, chose the word zejście rather than pogroms, the word anti-Jewish incidents, and in some cases, I've been at conferences where there have been maybe raising questions about the term pogrom. In other words, are there any cases in which any of you feel uncomfortable with the word pogrom to describe the incident as opposed to a riot or incident? I remember one point in a conference where in the 1881 incident of December 1881 in Warsaw, and the word pogrom was used, and then a scholar said they really objected to that term. It was more an incident or a riot. So I'm just wondering about the term itself. Does it apply to every single case we're speaking of that adds up to these numbers? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My comments to Professor Böhler regarding the role of peasantry in the spread of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish actions. From the perspective of the eastern borderlands of Poland, it's interesting to see that anti-Semitic agenda was actively used within the so-called peasants' armies, especially in Ukraine, and as well in present-day Belarus. And majority of the soldiers of the First World War were peasants, and the role of peasantry is really high in the different social and processes in this region, especially when there is a chain of wars, one military conflict replaced by another, and in this region, practically the military action stopped in the beginning of 20s, when we talk about eastern neighbors. So, just a question: Polish state managed to channel this energy of Polish peasantry to defend motherland. In the case of Soviet territories controlled by Soviets, we see that majority of the, not majority, certain part of soldiers who were mobilized to the ranks of Red Army, they really don't want to struggle. A great percent of deserters stayed in these foresty areas, and as well they were used by political opponents of Bolsheviks and attacked small Jewish colonies, practically eliminated some Jewish colonies. They attacked shtetls, and the most horrible situation appeared in Ukraine, where different political forces, Petluras, Machnos, and others perpetrated anti-Jewish crimes.
Thank you. Let's take one more question. Yeah, Marcus, yes.
Thank you to the panelists. I would like to make a comment regarding the framework, because we can take the question of Jews and not Jews, and the Jewish and Polish relations, and it is a case to study. And on the other side, we can take the Jewish question on the November hopes and fears to examine a conceptual issue, the issue of how we consider hegemonic conceptions of what is a state. In a state, we are in the eve of the creation of a new form of states, new kind of states. How they conceive what is a state, what are the limits of sovereignty, what are the international context of each state. That, I think that analyzing these November hopes and fears could give us a key to understand more deeply, if I may say so, these concepts. The question of how a group accept or incorporate the hegemonic views, how they are contesting the role of a subaltern group, how they are confronting these hegemonic policies. And that is a point that from one side, when we are very focused on these Jewish, non-Jewish, Polish, non-Polish, Jewish-Polish relations, and maybe in some way we are missing another topic that could be very fruitful, not only for the very field of Polish Jewish history, but in general, it could be a contribution of this field of study to understand the new reality created after November.
Well, I'll ask the panelists now to respond, and perhaps we'll go in reverse order this time, so I'll ask Jolanta to respond first.
There were raised three questions. Maybe I start with the first. So there is, in fact, a big discussion among Polish historians, what factor was more important, Polish activity, so uprisings, battle, or the decisions made by the great powers. And there are, there are a lot of points to mention, but first is that there was no such a battle for Czechish in the Czechish cause, and they received independence after the First World War. Yeah, so even without such a such a big activity, a lot of states received their independence. Of course, from the other point of view, this battle somehow this battle enabled Poles to say we did it. Yeah. So I think that these two factors, so the activity and also the international factor, was here very, very in the same. So they were important. The materials of the Morgenthau Commission, I think it's known. That they were published. I've read the whole Morgenthau archive. It's like 2,000 pages in Washington, and I've read every page. So this is, and not only me, some other historians did it and wrote about this. So I don't see any problem in it. This is, even you can go there and read it. The problem of the notion pogrom. When I wrote my first small book about anti-Semitism, not only pogroms but about rising anti-Semitism in the 30s, it was the beginning of the 90s. In fact, I was writing it in 89. So there was nothing. There was nothing in Polish literature about this. I was acting on a, unknown. I was in an unknown country. Yeah, I felt like this, and I had a problem, and I thought about this. But I think that not every riot could be described as pogrom. Not every, looting the shop could be described as pogrom. So that's why then I decided in this way, just now I would probably change this title. So there were pogroms, but not every act, anti-Jewish act, could be, according to my view, described as pogrom. Pogrom is a kind of massive event which involve some number of people. So the private actions, like, I don't know, 2 people beat another person on the street, couldn't be called like this. Even I have a problem with Pinsk to call this event pogrom. I think it was a kind of military action. So, in this sense, I think that we should somehow, even in our language, say about this. So when I hear there were hundreds of pogroms in Poland in the 18 and 19, I can't agree. There were pogroms. But I would reserve this name, this notion, for some events, and not to tell that there were hundreds of pogroms. I'm sorry, this is my view, and I answer Piotr.
I agree with you totally.
Yeah, but this is what I said just now. I would like to say that that history. I understand your problem with about teaching. Teaching about Polish Jewish history. I have not so much experience international, but I was invited to Bangkok to talk about Polish righteous among the nations. It was such an experience. How to say people who are obliged to to the special behavior towards the king, that you can do something against the rule, which was the case during the war. People were doing something against the German law, but it was the law. So, and 1,000 of times when I was accused of using the term Jews in Germany, students accused me that I divide Poles and Jews in Warsaw in the 19th century. That I should tell there were Poles and there were Poles of Jewish origin. But how we could, do this and say about Poles in Russian Poland and people who didn't perceive themselves as Jewish, not as Polish. So, in this sense, I would like to say that I choose telling what I think.
Rightly so. Catch. All right. So, thank you very much. Just 2 or 3 short remarks. First of all, as a person of at least partially peasant background, I would like to defend peasants a bit. I mean, there is no anti-Jewish gene or a gene of violence. And peasants had been manipulated by some priests, for instance, in Galicia, or some secular politicians, and sometimes peasants who are under-researched too, as a matter of fact, behave in a surprising way. Look at 1846, the Jacquerie of Galicia, right? 4,000 Polish nobles killed by the peasants. They didn't touch the Jews, even though they could. There was a situation that the Austrian authorities told them, go ahead and do whatever you want, right? They didn't kill the Jews. The peasants of Belarus are not really viciously anti-Jewish, and there were no pogroms after 1881 in this part of Russia. So peasants are a complex group as well. And yes, you are right, up to the early 20th century, probably, maybe not most, but a large part of Polish peasants didn't have a clear national identity. When my grandfather, Jakub Wróbel, moved from Western Galicia to Eastern Galicia to find a job in oil industry of Drohobych, to the local Ukrainians, or Rusins, or Boyko and Lemko people, he was not a Pole, he was a Mazur. Because Poles were Polish nobles, Polish officials, people like this. And poor Jakub Wróbel was a Mazur, right? So peasants are an uncharted territory too, and a very interesting story. Now, women. I agree with you totally. You're absolutely right. There should be more women here during this conference. No doubt whatsoever. Now, I disagree with your remarks about Rosa Luxemburg. I don't know this ranking, but if you want to know my personal views, Rosa Luxemburg was a fascinating person. I mean, imagine this, a Jewish handicapped girl from a small town in this heart of darkness, southern part of the Lublin region, becomes one of the chief leaders of the SPD, German Social Democracy, and writes very important books, etc., etc. It's a fascinating person, and I encourage you, I recommend that you read about Rosa Luxemburg. Now, as far as women's suffrage is concerned, this was a surprise, because the Polish progressive forces, political quote-unquote progressive forces, did it. I mean, gave women voting rights. But then Piłsudski and his helpers and the entire left was really disappointed. because women voted conservative in 1919. During the first elections, most women voted conservative for national democracy. Oh, well, okay, complex thing. Now, Henry Morgenthau published a fantastic book. The title is All in a Lifetime, and there is the report there you can read here in Warsaw. And several members of Morgenthau Commission published memoirs as well, extremely interesting. And in addition to everything, it seems that Henry Morgenthau was a bit pro-Polish, even though he gave those numbers, etc., etc. And some Jews were actually angry that he was wooed by the Polish aristocracy, and that there was something in this. And finally, sorry, this is my last remark here. I'm always nervous about this. First, I would like to defend a bit Józef Piłsudski. I mean, nobody's perfect, and it's difficult to be perfect all the time, but relatively speaking, in a broader context, Józef Piłsudski at that time was my hero. Yes, he did several very controversial things. But even in 1926, believe me or not, because when we judge somebody's deeds, we ask usually about intentions. You did this, what were your intentions? Piłsudski believed in 1926 that he defended democracy because he could not stomach the national democracy and the crawling revolution which was going on in Poland. And he wanted to stop it. And he believed he defended democracy. Later things happened, that's true, but at least intentions were like this. And talking about state and the concept of state, he had an interesting concept of state too. His federation idea maybe was naive, but it was, noble. It was something that was idealistic. Then paradoxically, Józef Piłsudski with his ideas contributed to an endek state, and finally Poland became an endek state. But there is something I really worry about. Right now, I believe in this era of globalization, we are constructing something which could be called an international body of knowledge on mankind's history, how we understand our history. I compared English language history textbooks from Hong Kong, Singapore, and some other places like this to see how the Polish contribution looks like, what we, the Poles, were able to add to this narrative. And I'm sorry to say, it doesn't look good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. On się zawsze śmieje. Ja znam go od latach, to nic nie znaczy.
This is not about the topic. This is my nervous laugh. Śmieję się z siebie. Yeah. But I agree with you. I could not play poker. Yeah. That's true.
not really, Piotr. The questions have been asked, they already have partly been answered, but I still give my share to this, my 50 cents. On the Morgenthau Commission, something that I would like to stress is that in my personal or in my academic view, it has been really a real good report. Because Morgenthau grasped some of the important aspects of the mechanism of anti-Jewish violence in 1918 and 19, and he clearly stated that there was no, as we know today, but how to state it a couple of weeks or months after the events, that there was no governmental policy to persecute Jews and to kill Jews, and it was important to make that point, especially given the bad press that Poland had by that time in the West. And that there were certain mechanisms of violence, which Christopher Browning would find out later or describe densely in relation to the Second World War and the German police battalions, like gaining just material gain, the situational and motivational factors like anti-Semitism. In this case, it had an impact. But I go with you with your lecture of yesterday that we have to re-evaluate how much it was really important on the discursive level. But in the violence, anti-Jewish violence, it could be mobilized. Yeah, but the Morgenthau report, as I did my studies on the anti-Jewish violence in 18 and 19, I was stunned how close it was to what we could say now after 100 years about the same things. The Polish fights, I wouldn't say that the Polish fights for the borders were the fights for independence, because Polish got the independence, luckily, after more than 100 years of partition, more or less by the fact that the empires vanished, because they just made themselves vanish in a really brutal war, which very much affected also the Polish population, as we know, and the Jews and Poles and other minorities living in these lands. About the border wars, and if we should remember them as wars of liberation, I've seen a lecture that Timothy Snyder gave a couple of weeks ago in Gdańsk, and he said there is the kingdom of memory and the kingdom of history, and he does not say that only the one is right and the other one is wrong, but he says he prefers to be in the kingdom of history, in the memory. These struggles of Poland for the borders are these liberation struggles, and there is a point to this if you see it only from the Polish perspective, of course. If you see it from the perspective of their neighbors, everybody has every country, every state has its own struggle for independence and the wars of liberation. So the Lithuanians could say the same, the Ukrainians can say the same. So what does it tell us about how we evaluate these things? As a historian, that I went into these conflicts and the struggles of about the borders of the Polish Republic, Second Republic, I was stunned by the fact that if you go into the border regions where these battles took place, and you see what the population thinks about it, and we talk about hopes, the population in the Kresy, or in Upper Silesia, or in Szczecin, Silesia, or in the Polish-Lithuanian borderlands, hoped that the violence would stop. They had 4 years of a really brutal war and of a, do not be misunderstood, of a real hard German occupation. It was not compared to the Second World War. We all agree about that, but it was not a nice time either. And they hoped this to stop. So if all the people that we would, or that would call themselves Poles by that time, would have been fervent nationalists and said, we want our national state, they would say this violence is necessary and we want it whatever cost. But if you look into diaries of the borderlands, where people have mixed identities, and you have a family of Polish-Ukrainian marriage or whatever you can imagine, and we have it until today in borderlands. These people didn't see this. I don't say that you cannot look at these struggles from a certain point of view, but you can also look at it from another point of view. And if you look at the people that were in these embattled borderlands, and you read what they wrote down, they say that it's a fratricidal struggle, and I found it everywhere in the borderlands. They talk about civil war. They're not talking about wars of liberation, because they hoped that the violence of the Great War would stop, and they thought it would stop earlier and not later. So the question about the peasants, the Polish case is not unique. It was also hard to mobilize the peasants, even during the Red Army's advance on Warsaw. The young soldiers that would join the Polish army to defend Poland, by their own will, most of the majority of them were the intellectuals that have been already taken part in the nationalist discourse, that declared themselves openly that we are Polish patriots. in the countryside, you don't find this discourse. You find, of course, patriotic Polish peasants who would go to the take up arms and fight, but you will find a lot of deserters, a lot of people not willing to give their sons to another bloodshed after they have been serving in the imperial armies for 4 years and firing at each other. So, and this is not so different from what we just heard about what the peasants in the either peasant armies in Ukraine or in the Red Army or whatever. For peasants, the war destroyed what they had, their land. And after 4 years of a great war, peasants if Polish or Ukrainian or Lithuanian or German, I mean German was not hit by this war destruction, but in the very territories where the war had taken place, the war of the empires, prolonged by the heirs of the empires, was a tragedy. And they wanted to have their sons back, if it was possible, if they haven't lost their lives on the battlefield. And they wanted to till the earth and to save and to build up what was still existent. Sorry that I was much too long. Sorry.
No, thank you. I just make one comment that just as the term pogrom is problematic, I find the term peasant, certainly in English, problematic. It would be very good if we could... No, I'm not saying you... I don't know what the alternative is, but it would be...
Farmer?
Well, small farmer, maybe.
Yeah, you know, in North America, there are no peasants, except for Mexico and perhaps...
Well, you remember in the carol about good King Wenceslas, yonder peasant, who is he? It's now become a joke in English, and it doesn't sound right. Anyway, that's a very minor point, David.
All right, I can claim no peasant ancestry. At age 14, I was sent to an agricultural school where the one thing I learned was that I am allergic to everything that grows in the ground. There's much to talk about here. On documentation on the violent events of 1918-19, there is the extensive archive of the Morgenthau Commission, which actually has two parts. There are the official documents compiled by the commission that were turned over to the American Commission to negotiate peace. And then there are documents that Morgenthau collected on his own, which are also quite voluminous. And the overlap is minimal, actually. There is also documentation from the Samuel Commission. There were a number of military investigating commissions also. There was a French commission led by Alfred Noulon. So there is a very large amount of material collected by foreign investigators. There is also a very large amount of material deposited in Polish archives by various investigating commissions that were launched internally, one by the Foreign Ministry, one by the Ministry of Justice. And these materials really have been mined, and we do know a lot, and there is literature about it, and it can be read. On the subject of literature, we have a language problem, ladies and gentlemen, because what Professor Wróbel says about the lack of new literature on interwar Poland does not apply to a very considerable literature being published in Israel in the Hebrew language, which unfortunately is not accessible to an increasing number of people who are interested in the subject. Professor Zilber, sitting in the back room, published just a couple of years ago an extensive study of the genesis of Polish independence during the First World War and Jewish political maneuvering, negotiation, the crystallization of the positions that we've seen described here, and it remains virtually unknown. And this is to be regretted, and regretted seriously, and I will say that there are many of us who are not native to the areas that we study, who have invested an effort in learning to read the languages of that area, Hebrew is an important language of scholarship. And for those who are seriously interested in studying the history of of this region and of Jews in this region, acquiring a reading command of that language really is essential. Terminology and pogroms. Right? I have expatiated on this subject ad nauseam.
We want to hear it again.
You want to nauseate me? Very briefly, any time a term becomes problematic and you wonder, should I use it here or not use it here? The answer is don't. Put the term aside and think about what it is you really want to talk about. Yeah. There is nothing out there in nature called a pogrom. Yeah. You cannot find the ideal Platonic pogrom and measure any instance against a certain set of standards. Each of us is free to use the term any way we want. I am amused by the distinction that some people draw between a pogrom and a military riot, because the etymological history of the word, which dates back to the 16th century in Russian, the word is used to refer precisely to a military riot. The word has a long history. It was introduced into English by a man named George Kennan, the great uncle of the famous American Cold Warrior, describing Russian prison guards putting down a riot in a prison camp. It was used in the late 1890s by a Jewish journalist from Warsaw named Nahum Sokolov, writing in Hebrew to describe violence perpetrated by Jews against Czechs, by Germans against Czechs and by Czechs against Germans in Prague. Not applied to Jews at all, right? So the word has tremendous elasticity, and no one can say to anyone, you're using it correctly and you're using it incorrectly. So, you can make a catalog of instances of violence in which one group has attacked another in the name of that group, and I won't repeat my entire article on the subject, but let's say that you can identify a set of such instances that display certain characteristics. Well, those common characteristics will justify you in analyzing that set together, but it doesn't matter what you call it. You can call it set Q sub 1, for that matter, or tuna fish, or anything you like, right? The important thing is that you know the essential characteristics that make up the set that you're analyzing, right? And that's what you have to think about, because what's at stake in a label like pogrom is mainly judgment, right? It's mainly an emotional valence, right? Which really doesn't have to interest us as analysts, right? So whenever it gets in the way, if pogrom is a problem for you, don't use the word. Think about what are the characteristics that make up the set of events that you're interested in, and talk about them. That is my advice. Anything else that I have missed here?
I think not. I think that we gradually need to bring this last session to an end. I've been asked by the organizers to make a few observations, which I'll make very briefly.
I wanted to say just one other
thing. Oh, yeah, sure, please.
One other thing. Hopes and fears. Disentangling hopes and fears is really an impossible task. They go together. If anyone has ever had the experience of undergoing a medical test, because of suspicion that there may be something wrong, he knows how hopes and fears live together and how they really cannot be separated from one another.
I have to have a test tomorrow, so you're probably right on it. Well, let me
hope it will be all right.
Yes, we do, certainly. Let me briefly summarize some of the main themes which we have investigated in the last 2 days. And I'll try and do this first chronologically. I think that a lot of the papers did show how the emergence of an independent state was the result of two separate developments. One, the conflict between the three empires which had partitioned Poland in the 18th century and then again in the early 19th century, and the emergence of new political forces on the Polish lands which supplanted the previously dominated positivist orientation, which was a form of liberalism but which also did not see Polish independence as a short-term goal. It was something which would be achieved after the creation of a properly functioning Polish society. And the three main forces which emerged were integral nationalism in the form of the National Democrats, National Socialism, if one can use this term, that is to say, the Pilsudskiite view that you could combine the pursuit of national independence with a socialist goal, and internationalist socialism. We mentioned Rosa Luxemburg here, and she was perhaps on the Polish lands, along with Julian Machlewski, the best exponent of this particular ideology. But of these ideologies, the most damaging in terms of Polish-Jewish relations was obviously the Endetsia, and I think that a number of people described how in the period before the First World War, Polish-Jewish relations deteriorated seriously, particularly in the Kingdom of Poland and particularly after the Duma elections of October 1912. The second theme which came up in a lot of the papers was the first period of the war during which the main parts of Poland were under Russian rule, Kingdom of Poland, the Kresy, and much of Galicia. And as is well known, the Russians did not, or the Tsarist government did not change its policy towards the Jews, which essentially saw them as a hostile element which needed to be contained. And this period saw a further deterioration of relations in the Kingdom of Poland between Poles and Jews, because the majority Polish opinion supported the Endetsia, which supported the Russian war effort. And it also was accompanied, no, but we didn't talk about this that much, although it did come up in Professor Prokopianiec's paper. It also saw the occupation of much of Galicia by the Russians and the savage persecution of the Jews there, which has been described by Shai Ansky. The establishment of German rule was the subject of a lot of discussion, and it had a number of different aspects to it. It saw first the establishment of proper new systems of local government, and what was interesting there was the difference between Łódź and Warsaw. And this is something which one also sees in the interwar period. Łódź remained a center of hostility, or center of resistance to the establishment of a more totalitarian system in Poland. The Jewish socialists and the Polish socialists combined in 1936 and 1938 in Łódź. Łódź remained, as they said then, red. This is a very interesting story. Michal is an expert on this, but it was very different from Warsaw, where the local Polish population was much more inclined towards the National Democrats. There is the more general issue of the goals of the Germans in Eastern Europe, how far these were merely utopian, and how the Germans came increasingly to place their hopes on the Poles, seeing that although there was support for Jewish aspirations, this was against the general German interest. Had the Germans won the war, how this would all have evolved is a very interesting question, which I will not answer. David already accused me of having my counterfactual day yesterday. The third feature of the German rule, and this is comes out very much in Robert Blobaum's work on the subject, is the economic exactions, which were even more extreme in the Oberost, because Hindenburg in Oberost acted even more ruthlessly in the long term. And we can understand why this was the case. But I think David appealed to us to avoid judgments. Obviously, one has to make some judgments, but this was part of the general context of the war. The collapse of German rule and the two revolutions in Russia in February and October, old style, in 1917, led to the outbreak of civil war in Eastern Europe, or in this northeastern Europe. And this was a four-way civil war between, on the one hand, the whites hoping to re-establish Tsarist rule or something like Tsarist rule, the Bolsheviks trying to establish a socialist form of state, the various national groups, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, people in the Caucasus, Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, trying to establish national states, and various peasant formations, of whom the most important are identified with the name Machno. We all know that civil wars are brutal, and that 3- or 4-way civil wars, think about Yugoslavia, are particularly brutal. And this was a particularly brutal civil war. In Ukraine, the figure of deaths, Jewish deaths, is the total figure of deaths in this civil war is probably between 7 and 8 million. And the number of Jewish deaths, again, it's a bit like the Chinese. What are you worrying about 100,000 Jews? Think about 7 million. Every death is a tragedy, and obviously we need to take that into account. But the outcome of the civil war is well known. The Ukrainians and the Belarusians did not succeed in establishing independent rule. The Poles, the Czechs, the Poles and the Balts did. The Caucasian states did not. But here, and I'll stress again what I said before, the Poles were divided on how to achieve this, and the end result was the worst possible for Poland. Pilsudski attempted the federal solution without success, and what we had was a Poland in which Poles made up less than 70% of the population, but which was governed essentially on national democratic principles. I'm now talking like David, but I think that is correct, and I quoted Piotr on this yesterday. I won't read that quotation again, but I think it is a very judicious quotation, that, as he said, this was the worst possible outcome, and it paved the way, inevitably, for the subsequent developments, which, again, we all know about. Well, let me, in conclusion, say that, in my own defense, I did talk about hopes yesterday, and I'll talk again about hopes in conclusion. The first was, and we haven't talked that much about it, is that one of the results of the First World War, and this is important in Eastern Europe, and one could discuss why this happened, was that Zionism gained international recognition, first in the form of the Balfour Declaration of November 1917, whose centenary we were also celebrated last year, and secondly in the international recognition of this declaration at the San Remo conference somewhat later. Secondly, for all their faults, the National Minorities Treaties, which did provide a guarantee for nationalities, and Louis Marshall, one of their architects, spoke in very glowing terms, which I quoted yesterday. They sound rather hollow today, because the problem was that in order to bring a complaint to the League of Nations, you had to have a state supporting you, and the Jews quite understood very well that to go to the Germans and ask them to put their claims against the Polish government was not actually going to make their life much easier. So there were almost no Jewish complaints to the League of Nations using this treaty, contrary to the Polish propaganda on this matter. Thirdly, there was a brief period in both Poland and Lithuania in which democratic systems functioned. And even when they collapsed in 1926 in both countries, there was a brief period when, certainly down to 1930, the Pilsudski regime pursued policies towards the national minorities and towards the Jews, which were relatively sensible. And the same could be said about Smetona. The same could also be said about the new Soviet Russia and the new Soviet Union. There were two revolutions in Russia. There was three revolutions. There was the February Revolution, the October Revolution, but then there was Stalin's revolution. And it is perfectly possible to envisage a different evolution in the Soviet Union. Say Bukharin had come to power. Again, I'm into counterfactual again. where this peculiar combination...
Those are hopes.
These are hopes. Yes, they are hopes. Posthumous hopes. But the Soviet policy towards the Jews in the 1920s was integration. The Jews were to be transformed into citizens of the Soviet Union, but this was going to take some time, and in order to facilitate this, a degree of Jewish self-autonomy was allowed, which went quite far, expressed through the Yiddish language.
And Polish as well.
Yes, quite. There was Polish autonomy, that's certainly true. Marchlewsk and Dzerzhinsk, and this was, of course, done away with in 1938. There's a new book on this subject. Let me, in conclusion, return to David's very challenging address last night, which I spent quite a lot of time thinking about. This is, David said, after sleeping. The trouble is, when you think about these things, you don't actually sleep, but still. And my conclusion on this is as follows, that the problem, if one looks at Polish history from the end of the 19th century to the present day, what one sees is a conflict between two concepts of Polishness. One narrowly ethnic concept of Polishness, Polak to Catholic, which sees Europe as a threat, which sees a certain type of Catholicism as the necessary bulwark to the Polish identity, and which, I mean, since I don't care for this view, I'm probably parodying. This is a slightly parodic view of it, and which sees itself as obviously ethnically and religiously exclusive. But against this, there was a different form of Polishness, which was in some ways expounded by Pilsudski, but also by many others, Boy-Żeleński, Gombrowicz, I could name many, which thought in terms of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious Poland, part of Europe, and a country in which these national myths on which we were all brought up, that Poland is a martyr and hero, and that the exponent of democratic values, which is never fully understood by the West, which constantly betrays us, which saw it as its role to de-bronze, to use Gombrowicz's phrase, these national myths. And that conflict hasn't gone away. And that conflict is still with us. And I assume that because Poland is deeply divided, and you can go for days around here without actually meeting people who express or support the first view, that most of us support this second view, and we all hope that this second view will prevail. But given the general rise of populism and what's going on, particularly in the United States, I think there are more fears than hopes, and I'll conclude at that point. But before I conclude, I want firstly to thank the organizing committee, Jerzy Kochanowski, Artur Markowski, who's somewhere around, Markus Zilber, Daria Stola, Michal Trembacz, who've done a wonderful job bringing together this group. And I think that it's been a very stimulating 2 days. And I'm very glad that we had a large public meeting last night. It would have been even better if we'd had even more people, but we had a lot of people there. And this was an important and challenging event. I'd also like, on everybody's behalf, to thank Joanna Wojcicka-Warda, who I think is somewhere in the back there. If she is, she should certainly stand up. I think Artur is trying to find her. No, she does. But I think that we all know how much she helped us, how much effort she put into making sure that all the arrangements of the conference were as they should be. And if I can say, just express one of my own prejudices, I much prefer to be in the Ibis Hotel than in the Harenda Hotel. It's nearer and much more agreeable, and I'm very glad that we were able all to be there together, and I very much thank all those who participated. And now I'd ask Michal Trembacz to say. Oh, I should also thank, as somebody pointed out, the translators. It's very difficult when one has one of these multilinguistic conferences. Many people used English, but of course there are people who didn't, and it's very important that everybody should have had this opportunity. And I know how difficult it is, particularly without texts, to do this translation. So I'd like very much again to thank the translators and Michal.
So I won't be stressing the translators anymore. I would just wanted to thank Professor Polonsky for such a kind words about the conference, and I wanted to say that this conference will have a continuation, and I'm happy to announce that there will be a special issue of East European Jewish Affairs dedicated to the papers that were presented here at this conference, and I will be getting in touch with the panelists and all the participants of the conference in the near future. And I just wanted to add a small thing to this, that the lecture from yesterday by Professor Engel was the first in series of lectures which are devoted to our temporary exhibition, but are also devoted to the topic of our conference and to the independence of Poland, 100 years of independence, and to the issues that it brings. And the next lecture will be by Professor Katarzyna Sierakowska. We will have also Professor Daniel Heller speaking here next year, but also Anna Szyba, Marta Ciesielska, and Cecil Kuznic will join us here at the Polin Museum next year. So I hope that at least some of you will be able to come, and if not, all of the lectures will be recorded and you will be able to see them at our webpage. Thank you very much.